Who dares to defy the unyielding ocean? Who stakes everything on a single voyage that could rewrite the fate of nations? His name was Vasco da Gama, a man who challenged the vast Atlantic and charted a course to India. But who was he before becoming the emblem of Portugal's maritime empire? The story that unfolds is not just about a man, but about choices that echoed through centuries. Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like it, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. Born on Portugal's southern shores, in a small coastal town called Sines, Vasco da Gama emerged into a world shaped by relentless Atlantic winds, salty marshes, and rolling low hills. The exact date of his birth remains a mystery, but most historians agree it was in the second half of the 15th century. His early years were spent in a nation hungry for the sea, where each port was a gateway to the unknown, and every expedition was a gamble on wealth, fame, and power. Yet, beneath this adventurous spirit, shadows of peril and uncertainty loomed. His father, Estevão da Gama, was a minor nobleman in charge of the fortress at Sines, tasked with defending the coast from fearsome Berber pirates and maintaining local order. Though not wealthy, the family bore an ancient coat of arms and enjoyed royal patronage, a fragile status balancing honor and vulnerability. His mother, Isabel Sodre, hailed from a family steeped in naval tradition, known for producing captains and navigators who braved the treacherous seas. Within this household, tales of storms, distant lands, and maritime battles whispered through the halls, shaping young Vasco's destiny. Though little is documented about his childhood, it is believed that Vasco received an education befitting his noble birth. He learned to read, write, and mastered Latin, arithmetic, and the basics of astronomy and navigation. His schooling likely began at a parish or church school in Sines, and later continued in Coimbra, home to one of Europe's oldest universities. Here, amid scholarly debates and the study of celestial mechanics, geography, and seamanship, Vasco absorbed the knowledge that would fuel his future voyages. Yet, it was not just education that molded him. It was the very spirit of the age. Portugal was transforming into a maritime powerhouse under King John II, who launched relentless quests for a sea route to India. Every foray south along Africa's coast was marked by tension and discovery, each new ship bringing back gold, spices, and tales of exotic shores. Maps began to reveal lands beyond the Cape of Good Hope, and rumors of India's wealth beckoned like a siren's call. The impossible was becoming inevitable. Vasco da Gama grew up in a world where the sea was more than water. It was a strategic weapon in a deadly game of empires. His family's ties to the Order of Santiago, a religious and knightly brotherhood combining military service with Christian devotion, linked them closely to the king, who himself was Grand Master of the order. This connection brought patronage and protection, but also pressure. The fate of a nation and the weight of destiny rested on young Vasco's shoulders, as an irreversible choice loomed on the horizon. This was not merely the story of a boy from a humble noble house. It was the prelude to an expedition that shattered centuries-old trade routes, redrew the map of the world, and unleashed a ruthless struggle for control of the spice markets. The first encounter in India was fraught with tension and misunderstanding, and the second voyage was marked by cruelty and unrelenting hardship. Behind every decision lay the brutal realities of empire and faith, ambition and fear. What legacy did Vasco da Gama leave behind? What price was paid for his daring crossing? This is a story of one man's will, one idea, and one route that changed history forever. But the question remains, at what cost? The tides of fate had turned, and there was no turning back. If you want to dive deeper into these gripping tales, suggest new topics in the comments and subscribe to Quiet History. Stories that haunt your dreams are told here every day. What drives a man to choose duty over self? What weighs heavier, the loyalty to crown or the whispers of personal ambition? Vasco da Gama, cloaked in the symbol of a powerful order, carried more than fabric over his shoulders. He bore a legacy, a code inherited from his father, binding him to a vision that transcended his own life, a devotion to the state, a mission carved into his very soul. Yet, how would this allegiance shape the course of history as the tides of destiny surged forward? The year was 1492. Vasco da Gama, still young and unproven, was entrusted by King John II with a delicate yet ruthless task. Castilian traders had dared to defy Portugal, their ships harbored on the southern coasts, while Portuguese vessels were seized up north. The king's order was clear: confiscate their property, strike back silently but decisively. Vasco executed without scandal, his resolve and leadership beyond question. A small act in the grand theater of Europe, yet it was the first proof that he could wield royal command with unyielding precision. But this was only the beginning. What storms lay ahead? By 1495, the winds of change swept through Portugal's royal court. King Manuel I ascended the throne, a man fueled by dreams of exploration and conquest. The impossible dream of reaching India by sea, circumnavigating Africa, crossing the vast Indian Ocean, was no longer just wishful thinking. The council debated fiercely. Who possessed the courage and skill to undertake this perilous voyage? Vasco da Gama's name emerged, a man yet unknown beyond his homeland, but embodying qualities rare and vital. Would he rise to embody the hopes of a nation? He was no merchant's puppet, no pawn of powerful trading interests. He was a son of a noble line, a loyal servant to the crown, forged by discipline and duty. His mind was a vessel filled with knowledge, his spirit sharpened by challenges, his heart steeled to navigate not just seas, but the tides of power and loyalty. The stakes were staggering. One misstep could unravel Portugal's maritime empire before it was born. Yet the man who had never sailed beyond Europe was now poised to cross boundaries no European dared cross. Could the weight of history rest on shoulders so untested? Portugal, at the close of the 15th century, was on the brink of transformation. Decades of relentless voyages had charted the African coasts, pushed past Senegal, Congo, and the southern tip of the continent itself. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, schools of navigation rose, and explorers tested the limits of the known world. Bartolomeo Diaz had braved violent storms to round the cape that promised hope, a new route to India that would bypass the Islamic intermediaries who controlled the land routes. But with King John II's death and Manuel's rise, the political game intensified. The order that Vasco da Gama belonged to gained influence, bolstering his family's standing and granting him fierce backing. Yet would this political leverage be enough to carry them through the coming tempest? Vasco da Gama's youth was steeped in the discipline of that order. Cloaked in its cross, he absorbed a mindset of unwavering service. The mission was clear: serve the realm, not self. His first true test, the punitive expedition of 1492, was a brutal rehearsal. Castilian assets seized, retaliation cold and methodical. It proved he could execute royal will without hesitation, but the sea held far greater challenges than a coastal raid. As the horizon beckoned, so did the unknown dangers: storms, starvation, and the looming specter of failure. Would his resolve hold firm when the ocean swallowed certainty? As the decade waned, the ambitions of a kingdom grew ever bolder. The promise of a sea route to India was no longer a hopeful whisper. It was an urgent quest, a desperate gamble. Vasco da Gama, though untested on such journeys, was chosen not by fame, but by the quiet strength of his character. No entanglements to cloud his loyalty, no competing interests to divide his focus. He was the embodiment of the crown's will, a man ready to carve a path into darkness where others feared to tread. But beneath this resolve lay a crucible of fear of the endless ocean, fear of the unknown, fear of the irreversible consequences awaiting beyond the horizon. The ships set sail into the blistering sun, the land fading into memory. Weeks into the voyage across the South Atlantic, the relentless heat pressed down, a cruel companion to the crew's growing dread. For days, the ocean offered no landfall, only endless blue and merciless skies. The journey was testing more than navigation. It was testing the limits of human endurance and faith. Every decision mattered, every choice a thread in the fragile tapestry of survival. Would Vasco's leadership be enough to steer them through this living nightmare? The fate of an empire balanced on the edge of despair. This was no ordinary voyage. It was a crucible of fate. Vasco da Gama was about to step beyond the familiar into a world where every choice was irreversible, every moment weighted with consequence. The sea held its breath, the horizon held its secrets, and history waited for a man, for a decision that would echo through the centuries. What price would be paid for the glory to come, and who would survive the journey to claim it? As we unravel the threads of Vasco da Gama's early years, we glimpse the forging of a legend. Discipline, loyalty, and silent determination were his weapons. The crossroads of history demanded more than courage. It demanded a man shaped by duty, driven by a vision larger than himself. The sea was calling. The empire was at stake. The question remains, how many would fall before the dawn of a new world? Subscribe to Quiet History to follow the next chapter of this epic saga. What happens when the ocean becomes not a pathway, but a prison? Supplies spoiled beyond use, fresh water stagnated in barrels, and dampness gnawed at the sailors' clothes. Below deck, mold crept like a silent enemy. The air was thick with unbearable heat and suffocating humidity, while an ominous sickness spread, diarrhea, relentless and merciless. Fear gripped even the strongest hearts as isolation stretched out endlessly, the vast unknown swallowing hope. Then, one stormy night shattered the fragile order. The fleet scattered like leaves in a gale, Visual contact with the other ships lost for hours. Did they realize how vulnerable they truly were? Dawn's fragile light brought reunion, but the scars of that night had already reshaped their fate. Vasco da Gama tightened command, enforcing strict new signal protocols and night watch rules, attempts to control chaos born from desperation. By early October, colder air whispered dangers as the fleet pushed into southern waters. Storms grew fierce, winds sharp and unforgiving. Rigging tore under the strain, sails ripped, and men were cast into the merciless waves, lost before rescue could arrive. The Santa Fe's rudder swelled and buckled, nearly sending the ship off course, every moment a battle against the ocean's wrath. Below deck, sickness festered, mystery diseases sapping strength, teeth falling out, sores blooming on flesh. Death stalked the crew relentlessly, some to fever, others to starvation. Could they endure what nature had unleashed? A violent storm near present-day Angola ripped apart the cargo ship's deckhouse, turning it from a vessel into a liability. The fleet pressed onward, though each step forward was paid in pain and loss. On November 4th, they reached the southern coast of Africa, the threshold of uncharted terror. The Cape of Good Hope loomed, known from tales but never conquered. It was more than a landmass. It was a living storm where winds clashed and seas swallowed ships whole. For 3 brutal weeks, the fleet tried to round the Cape, only to be pushed back by relentless winds or trapped by deadly calm. Water ran low, food dwindled, hope slipped through their fingers like sand. On the San Gabriel, the cook died, delirium claiming him in the stifling heat of the hold. Another sailor was swallowed by a wave, lost to the merciless sea forever. Then, under unbearable strain, Paulo da Gama forced a brief respite at St. Helena Bay, land, finally, after months at sea. For the first time in ages, they touched earth again, gathering herbs, washing clothes, repairing torn sails. Their eyes met those of the Kins, nomadic herders of this strange land. Initial contact was cautious, a fragile exchange of gestures, beads, and bells. But neither side fully understood the other. Missteps led to violence, one soldier wounded, a brief but sharp fight, and Vasco's grave order to withdraw without bloodshed. This first clash with the people of southern Africa marked a warning. Ignorance of language and customs could turn to deadly consequences. With a change in the wind at the end of November, the fleet finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope. All ships survived, but limped forward, battered and broken. Masts creaked under strain, hulls demanded urgent repair, and crews were hollowed by exhaustion. Yet they had crossed a boundary not just of geography, but of the known world itself. Beyond lay the mysterious eastern coast of Africa, monsoon winds, and the promise of India. The last and most perilous leg of this epic journey awaited. For a fleeting moment, the men dared to believe the worst was behind them. But it was an illusion. Ahead stretched land unseen by any European before, hostile, unknown, alive with new dangers. The ships sailed northeast along the coast, buffeted by shifting currents and unpredictable winds. Every decision carried irreversible weight. Every choice might be their last. What fate awaited them beyond the horizon? Only the unforgiving sea and the silent lands could say. If you want to witness the full saga of courage, fear, and the consequences of desperate choices, subscribe to Quiet History and journey deeper into the shadows of the past. What happens when desperation drives men to the edge? Vasco da Gama's fleet was trapped in a deadly spiral of sickness and dwindling supplies, their bodies ravaged by scurvy, relentless heat, and poisoned water. Many sailors could barely stand. Death stalked them one by one. Despite exhaustion, the survivors were forced to work, patching sails, cleaning holds, bailing water, and fending off rats. But this was only the beginning of their trial. Could they find refuge before it was too late? The southern Atlantic was unforgiving, and the diseases that plagued them showed no mercy. Fresh water, food, and a safe harbor were their desperate needs. When the fleet finally sighted Mozambique Island in early March of the year 98, hope flickered. This island, a bustling trade hub ruled by a Muslim leader, promised a chance to breathe. But danger loomed beneath the surface. Mistaken for Turks or Red Sea Muslims, the Portuguese were welcomed with cautious politeness. Vasco da Gama seized this misidentification, hiding their Christian identities behind dark clothes and beards, buying time with gifts of fine cloth, glass, and jewelry. In return, they received rice, coconuts, honey, and bananas, lifelines in their dire state. Yet language barriers soon fractured this fragile peace. Their lone translator, a Moor captured in Morocco, spoke only Moroccan Arabic, alien to the Swahili dialects of Mozambique. Misunderstandings mounted, suspicion brewed. Traders began to withdraw. Whispered warnings of Nazarene, the Christian outsiders, spread like wildfire. The local Cadi, blunt and unyielding, declared openly, "These men are not Muslims." A chill fell over the exchanges, and the island's ruler, though outwardly calm, moved with silent cunning. He sent 2 pilots as gifts, a show of trust or a trap. Underneath the surface, these men were agents of deception. One pilot misled the fleet, steering them towards treacherous reefs, confusing place names, sowing chaos. Vasco da Gama's suspicions grew. When the pilot was interrogated, he confessed. Orders were clear. Lead these ships to ruin. The betrayal forced the Portuguese to abandon Mozambique, their survival hanging by a thread. Where could they turn next? Mombasa, a wealthy city-state and a tempting prize, promised renewal. But the city was prepared, its welcome anything but warm. Armed boats blocked the harbor entrance, warnings echoed from the shore. Under the cover of night, shadowy figures crept close with torches and ropes, aiming for sabotage or fire. The fleet's guards responded with volleys of arquebus and cannon fire, shattering the night's silence. Dawn revealed a grim truth. They could not stay. No battle was fought, but the threat was clear. Hostility was absolute. The Portuguese fled Mombasa's harbor, their hopes dashed. Yet fate had one more card to play. Malindi, an ancient rival of Mombasa, beckoned as a potential ally. The city's rulers sent envoys with gifts, fruits, fabrics, and exotic animals, signaling a fragile but hopeful opening. Negotiations unfolded swiftly. Vasco da Gama, wary but pragmatic, stepped ashore, sensing a rare opportunity. Here he was seen not as an invader, but as a possible partner. The exchange of courtesies and goods rekindled the fleet's spirit, And though the shipments of pepper, cinnamon, and other spices were modest and far from industrial scale, they were proof that the path to India was not only open, it could bring immense wealth. In that moment, the impossible became real. The expedition had justified itself against overwhelming odds. Yet the greatest challenge loomed ahead, the return journey. Ships now carried the scent of spices on the wind, and in the hearts of the sailors a fierce pride burned. They had etched their names into history, but the ocean's final test was waiting. As August's end approached, the fleet prepared to face the unknown once more. Every decision, every choice had led to this irreversible crossroads. The story of courage, deception, fear, and survival was far from over. If you found this story gripping, subscribe to Quiet History for more tales where history's greatest moments hinge on the razor's edge of fate. What price does victory demand? How far are men willing to go when the stakes are boundless wealth and uncharted routes? In late August, the Portuguese fleet slipped away from the Malabar coast, their ships laden with sacks of precious spices, tangible proof of their conquest, and letters penned by exhausted, fevered souls who already understood the heavy toll exacted by this endeavor. The sea carried not only cargo, but the silent weight of sacrifice and unresolved questions. Yet the true trial was still to come, lurking beyond the horizon. The mission had been clear: open a path to India through trade, even if no formal treaty had yet been forged. This fragile beginning was enough to send a message across the seas to Lisbon. The route was not just discovered, it was viable and rich with promise. But what would this mean for those who dared to continue? The shadows of uncertainty stretched long over the fleet as it prepared for the perilous journey home. Would the spoils be enough to justify the hardships endured? On the decks, the intoxicating scent of spices mingled with salt and sweat, a sensory reminder that history was being written with every wave that rocked the ships. The sailors, their bodies battered but spirits alight, carried in their hearts the fierce conviction they had entered the annals of the world. Yet beneath the triumph lurked a silent fear. The return voyage promised trials as brutal as the conquest itself, where every decision could mean survival or doom. From the moment the fleet set sail, doubt gnawed at the minds of commanders and crew alike. Was this success a fragile illusion? The cost of opening this trade route was etched in the exhaustion and despair of those who had faced unknown dangers, epidemics, and hostile lands. Yet the undeniable fact stood firm. The expedition validated its own bold gamble. The Portuguese no longer questioned their path. The sea had spoken. But would it be merciful on the way back? Every decision carved into the future, irreversible and merciless. The men on board carried more than spices. They bore the weight of choices made in the face of fear and uncertainty. What might have been lost, what futures closed forever, as they embraced the perilous promise of empire and commerce. The returning route was not just a journey, it was a crucible, a test of human will against the boundless ocean's wrath. With each league sailed away from Malabar, the fragile victory transformed into a haunting question. Could they survive the voyage home? The taste of triumph was bittersweet, shadowed by the knowledge of the cost, the lives worn thin by fever and hardship, the silent toll of those who would never see Lisbon's shores again. The fleet's fate hung precariously, balanced on the razor's edge between glory and oblivion. Yet in that precarious moment, the fleet was alive with a fierce, unyielding spirit. The men clung to the knowledge that their names would be remembered, that the world had shifted because of their courage and sacrifice. The open path to India was no longer a dream, but a reality that promised unimaginable wealth and influence. But as the waves crashed and wind howled, the looming question remained: would their legacy be written in triumph or tragedy? The fleet's departure from Malabar was not just a step forward. It was a leap into the unknown. Each spice-filled sack was a symbol of victory, each letter a testament to human endurance. But beyond the horizon awaited the greatest test, a journey that would define the fate of an empire and the men who dared to sail for glory. The question that hung over every soul aboard was clear. Would history remember them as heroes or as ghosts lost to the sea? The Portuguese no longer doubted their destiny. The expedition had justified itself beyond hope or expectation. The route to India was open and lucrative, and the world would never be the same. But as the fleet vanished into the vast ocean, the real story, the crucible of survival and the unforgiving return, was only just beginning. The men had entered history, but history had not yet declared its verdict. Subscribe for more gripping tales from quiet history, where every decision echoes through time. What price do we pay when ambition meets the unforgiving sea? Did Vasco da Gama's bold voyage truly secure Portugal's destiny, or was it just the first step toward a harsher reckoning? The expedition had shattered doubt. The route to India was no longer a myth, but a brutal, tangible reality. Yet as the fleet prepared to turn homeward in late August, an ominous tension crept beneath the victorious air. The spices filled the air, intoxicating and promising wealth, but the true test awaited beyond the horizon. On the decks, the sailors breathed in the scent of success. Sacks of precious spices, tokens of a trade route born in fire and sacrifice. Letters from the exhausted crew revealed more than triumph. They whispered of suffering and survival against relentless odds. The victory was sealed, though fragile, with no formal treaty signed, only proof enough to sway the skeptical minds back in Lisbon. The path to India was open, but at what unseen cost? But the return journey loomed as a gauntlet of despair. The sea that had carried them to fame could just as easily swallow them whole. The crew, worn to bone and spirit, clung to a fragile hope. They had entered the annals of history, yet the price they paid would haunt them forever. Each knot sailed was a gamble, a step closer to either salvation or oblivion. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, a new storm brewed. In September, Francisco de Almeida set foot on foreign soil, greeted not with open arms, but wary eyes. Years had passed, and a younger generation of officials now wielded power. Men who regarded Almeida as a relic, a stubborn outsider, indifferent to their ambitions. Yet respect for the king's appointed viceroyal authority bound their tongues. Almeida's mission was just beginning, but resistance simmered beneath the surface. Almeida acted swiftly, imposing order where chaos threatened. He ordered audits of garrisons, scrutinized taxes, and tore apart corrupt alliances with local rulers. Dismissals followed, and arrests shattered complacency. One ship owner faced charges for secret trade with Muslim merchants, a direct challenge to royal decrees. In Cochin's treasury, silver was missing, a silent betrayal that threatened the fragile foundation of Portuguese dominion. Each decision Almeida enforced carved deeper into the volatile balance of power. The price of empire was counted not just in spices or silver, but in trust broken and enemies born. As shadows lengthened over the Malabar coast, the seeds of conflict were sown, a reminder that conquest carries consequences far beyond the initial triumph. The question remained, could Portugal hold its grip on a land that offered riches but demanded ruthless resolve? Back at sea, the returning fleet faced the unknown. The burdens they carried, both material and moral, weighed heavily. Each sailor knew that the voyage had changed them irrevocably. History had been made, but the future was a storm yet to be weathered. The journey back was not just a passage through water, but through fear, doubt, and the haunting cost of choices that could never be undone. Did the triumph of opening the sea route justify the suffering endured? Would the promise of wealth outweigh the human toll? The story of this expedition was not merely one of navigation, but of irreversible decisions, a testament to the brutal intersection of ambition and fate. Portugal's empire was born in these moments, forged in pain and uncertainty, destined to haunt those who dared to reach for the Spice Islands. As the fleet vanished into the horizon, filled with the sense of victory and the shadows of loss, one truth lingered. History remembers not just the conquerors, but the price they paid. Subscribe to Quiet History to uncover the untold stories behind every moment that shaped our world. What does it mean to lose trust when every decision shapes a fragile empire? How far can one man go to reclaim order when time relentlessly slips away? Vasco da Gama faced these questions as he sought to control the unraveling chaos in the Portuguese stronghold of Cochin. Hidden among the ports was a flight path used for illegal exports. Swift and public punishments followed, a harsh signal that discipline was non-negotiable. But were these measures enough to stop the decay? Discipline was restored among the soldiers. Unauthorized raids were forbidden, and the gathering of gifts from locals was strictly limited. Vasco da Gama began tense negotiations with the Raja of Cochin, aiming to revise treaties not with mercy, but as a calculated pressure play to regain lost trust. His actions no longer bore the cruelty of his youth, but were marked by a bitter restraint, a man now bent on correction rather than vengeance. Yet each step forward felt like walking on a knife's edge, threatening to snap. He was driven to rebuild order, to impose structure, even at the expense of his own health. But time was a merciless enemy. By October, his condition deteriorated sharply. The gout attacks that plagued him grew fiercer, compounded by fever and profound weakness. Vasco refused prolonged rest. Instead, he dictated orders from his chair, surrounded by doctors and servants. Was this stubbornness, or a desperate grasp at control before the inevitable? In November, his letters to Lisbon were filled with quiet desperation. He admitted he could not finish his mission, but urged the king to continue his work, to watch appointments closely and punish those who betrayed the crown's trust. These words echoed like a warning from a man standing on the edge of oblivion. Could the empire survive the loss of its steward? By mid-December, Vasco da Gama was bedridden. His final orders were whispered from his sick bed. A few days before death, he met with a priest, calm, without ceremony or theatrics. He bade farewell to his sons, repeating that he was dying on the land he once discovered, making no plea for anything beyond that. The silence of his last hours was profound, as if even the world held its breath. He died at dawn in a stone house outside Cochin, far from his homeland, yet not alone. His mission, unlike his voyages across stormy seas or battles fought, was a bitter and compressed struggle of governance and survival. Vasco da Gama did not return as a hero. He remained to die as a servant of the crown. What price does loyalty demand when the body fails before the cause? News of his death spread swiftly through Cochin. He was not merely a high-ranking official, but a man known to all, merchants, local rulers, and everyday people alike. The Raja of Cochin expressed condolences and sent a representative to the farewell. The Catholic mission arranged a funeral at the Church of St. Francis, the first European church on Indian soil, a symbol of the new era and the first resting place of Vasco da Gama's remains. The coffin was placed by the wall to the right of the altar. The service was solemn but restrained. A choir sang psalms while the priest spoke of unwavering service, and a scribe read the king's decree honoring the deceased's merits. Merchants and officers stood silent in a rare show of respect. In the harbor, not a single cannon was fired that day, a silence heavy with meaning. The body lay in Cochin for many years. Only decades later, at the behest of his widow and with royal approval, the decision was made to return him to his homeland. His remains were exhumed, placed in a fortified catafalque, guarded closely, and sent aboard a caravel bound for Lisbon. The voyage was long but uneventful, yet each wave carried the weight of a legacy. Upon arrival in Portugal, Vasco da Gama's remains were honored with a solemn transfer to Vidigueira, the city tied to his noble title and home to the family chapel. There, a chapel was specially built for his burial, marked by a tombstone inscribed in Portuguese and adorned with family crests and symbols of the Order of Christ, of which he was a member. Yet even this final resting place would not hold him forever. In the 19th century, amidst Portugal's romantic revival and search for national symbols, his remains were moved once more, this time to the Hieronymus Monastery in Lisbon, a monumental symbol of the era he epitomized. There, in a marble tomb carved with bas-reliefs, Vasco da Gama was immortalized, not just as a man, but as an emblem of a nation's past grandeur. But what price had been paid for this legacy? How many decisions, how much suffering had led to this solemn peace? The story of Vasco da Gama's final mission is a relentless tide of choices and consequences, a drama of a man caught between ambition, duty, and mortality. His life's end was not marked by glory, but by a quiet, bitter reckoning, a reminder that even the greatest journeys conclude far from the triumphant shores we imagine. Will you join us at Quiet History to uncover more stories where history's shadows shape the fate of men? What does it mean to chart a course into the unknown? What price does a man pay when he chooses a path that forever alters the world? Vasco da Gama faced these questions in a time when the seas were a vast, terrifying mystery, one that few dared to cross. His journey was not just a voyage, it was a fateful gamble with consequences that no one could yet imagine. 5 centuries ago, when da Gama's ships first slipped from the harbor of Lisbon, Europe's understanding of the world was still bound by ancient myths and shadowed maps. Africa's true shape was obscured, and India existed somewhere between legend and curiosity. But da Gama shattered these illusions, proving that a sea route to India was not just possible, it was inevitable. This revelation would change everything. What followed was more than just exploration. It was a ruthless rewriting of global power. Before da Gama, spices, silk, and precious gems traveled to Europe through a tangled web of Arab and Venetian middlemen, each step adding cost, time, and danger. But with da Gama's arrival in Calicut, Portuguese ships began to sail directly into Indian ports, cutting out the middlemen and claiming control over the flow of wealth. Portugal, a small kingdom clinging to the edge of Europe, suddenly stood at the center of a burgeoning empire. Fortresses and trading posts, factorias, rose like iron sentinels along India's coast, fortified symbols of a newfound dominance. These outposts were not merely centers of trade, they were the spearheads of empire, armed with powder, cloth, wine, and weapons, ready to enforce a brutal new order. But what of Vasco da Gama himself? In a cold December day of 1924, far from the glory of battle or the roar of the ocean, he died alone, not in combat, but seated by a window, staring out at the sea that had both defined and doomed him. In that moment, the circle he had drawn between life and ocean was finally closed, in a land he had once carved a path to, through darkness and danger. The legacy da Gama left was not just a map or a route. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power. His journey demolished old conceptions of geography, replacing myth with brutal reality. The age of exploration was not a gentle awakening. It was a storm, sweeping away empires, reshaping economies, and igniting conflicts that would echo for centuries. Through da Gama's eyes, the world was no longer a series of isolated kingdoms, but a connected, volatile network, a fragile web of commerce and conquest. His path sparked the beginning of globalization, an economic fusion that was neither kind nor peaceful, but unstoppable. What began as a search for spices became the blueprint for empire, ambition, and often ruthless domination. So who truly owned the seas after da Gama's first voyage? Who controlled the fate of nations and the flow of riches? The answer was no longer bound by geography, but by the unyielding will to command the waves. Vasco da Gama did not just find a route. He forged a new world order where every decision carried consequences as vast and deep as the ocean he dared to cross. From the shores of India to the heart of Lisbon, from the solitude of a man's final moments to the roaring tides of history, da Gama's journey was the sum of countless irreversible choices. Choices that reshaped continents, redefined destinies, and forever changed the course of humanity. His bones rest in a tomb marked by crosses and Latin inscriptions near the grave of Luis de Camões, the poet who immortalized da Gama's voyage in the epic Lusíads. Even in death, their stories remain intertwined, eternal witnesses to the relentless human drive to explore, to conquer, and to leave a mark on the world. And yet, The sea that gave life to da Gama's legend was also a silent judge, indifferent to empires or glory. It waits still, a vast horizon of unknowns, challenging the next generation to decide. Will their choices bring salvation or ruin? If you want to uncover more stories where human fear clashes with fate, where history turns on the edge of a decision, subscribe to Quiet History and dive into the past like never before.